guys, Matt from Renclif Media here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about time lapse, and I want to give you some really helpful tips that I've picked up over the years. So what are the type of things that you need to get started with time lapse? Well, beginning with number one, the first thing you need of course is a camera. So whether that's a mirrorless camera or a digital SLR, whatever camera it is, as long as it allows you to shoot on manual mode, it's going to do the job. Okay, so the next thing you're going to need is a tripod. One thing I also recommend when you're shooting time lapse is if it is a windy day, it's good to actually weigh down your camera by mounting either a bag or some sandbags on your tripod. And this is something that I do quite often. I just hang my camera bag off my tripod, and it helps add a bit of weight and reduces the amount of camera shake if it's going to be a windy day. And I recommend using a really good solid ball head like this one. And of course you're going to need an intervalometer. So intervalometer allows you to set the number of shots, the interval, and the duration. So that's going to allow you to shoot your time lapse and calculate the amount of time it's going to take. Tip number two, now I'm going to talk to you about setting up your camera properly before you even begin shooting your time lapse. The first thing you want to do is make sure your camera is shooting in RAW format. And this is very important because you want to be able to shoot in the best quality possible when you're capturing your time lapse. So if your camera doesn't shoot in RAW format, I recommend you switching to the highest quality JPEG possible, and that's just going to have to do. But I definitely recommend RAW if you can. The next thing you want to do is make sure your camera is set on manual mode. And you want to shoot in manual mode because you want to have full control over your aperture and your shutter speed settings. It's also very important to have your ISO set to the lowest possible number. So round about ISO 100 is ideal, and in bright lighting situations you're often going to be shooting in ISO 100, but if it's a bit cloudy or overcast you may have to increase your ISO to say 250 or 300, and that's fine. Most cameras these days are pretty good at high ISO anyway. So you also want to make sure that you're using a preset or a manual white balance setting, and I often use the Kelvin settings because I like to set my white balance manually. Otherwise, if you don't have Kelvin as an option in your camera, you can go with a preset white balance like direct sunlight or overcast or shade. Tip number three, make sure your camera is level before you begin shooting your time lapse. Now, this is something that can be corrected in post. You can level your photos in post in Lightroom or Photoshop, but it's definitely best practice to get it right in camera. And this is because when you're shooting time lapse, you want to be able to capture it in the highest resolution possible, especially if you want to show your time lapse in 4K. And when you're cropping and correcting your photos in Lightroom, you're going to lose a bit of resolution. Tip number four, use an ND filter when you're shooting time lapse. So an ND filter, or a neutral density filter, is a filter that screws onto the end of your lens and allows you to reduce the amount of light entering your camera. So this allows you to shoot longer exposures during the day in bright lighting situations, and it's an essential part of equipment that you need to carry around if you're going to shoot time lapse. Now I carry 3 different neutral density filters. I use the Hoya Pro filters. I find they're really good. They're affordable and they don't reduce the quality of my image when I use them. So they don't soften the image. They don't really have much of a color cast either. And I carry a ND 200, a 500 and a 100. And those are the ones I use most when I'm shooting time lapse. I find that a 100 or 200 allows me to do up from half a second to a couple of second exposures during the day in bright lighting. And I find that if I want to do longer exposures, like 10-second exposures during the day, I'll chuck on my ND 500. Tip number 5, adjust your aperture and shutter speed settings to get the best possible result when shooting your time lapse. So what I mean by this is it really depends on what you're shooting, whether it's a landscape or a cityscape, whether there's moving objects in the scene, whether it's people or cars or boats going across a harbour. That really determines what shutter speed you're going to use. So it depends what effect you're going for, whether you want the objects to have a lot of motion blur or whether you want the objects to be more sharp and clearer. So personally, I like a little bit of motion blur in my time lapses. It makes it look much nicer And the general rule is that you want to use a minimum shutter speed of about 1/60th of a second. And 1/60th of a second will give you a slight motion blur. And that just makes your time lapse look more film-like, more cinematic, and actually makes it look smoother as well. So you don't have objects looking all jumpy, moving around the frame. So those are just some general rules for adjusting your aperture and shutter speed. And usually when I'm shooting time lapse, I also like to start with my aperture around about f11, and then I'll usually work my way to my shutter speed. And the reason why I use f11 is because that's usually the sharpest point with most lenses. So ideally around about f11 is a good spot with aperture, so that you can have pretty much everything in focus as much as possible. And that was my top 5 tips for getting started with shooting time-lapse. I hope you found these tips really helpful. Whether you're new to shooting time-lapse or you've been doing it a little while, I hope you've learned something from these tips. So if you want to ask me anything, guys, feel free to post some comments below and I'll do my best to answer any of your questions. Thanks heaps for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to see more videos like this, more tips and more tutorials about filmmaking and photography, don't forget to subscribe to my channel.